Hello, everyone. Welcome to, well, whatever this is. I guess it's an interview, but I didn't want to call it an interview. That sounds really formal in a way. So I'll just call it a chat with someone who is obviously very talented and more talented than any of us in the band. This is Jonathan, and I won't butcher your Dutch last name. Could you, for the benefit of everyone? Uh,
Yeah, let's just do it in a Dutch way, which is van den Wijngaarden.
Van der Lijngaten. There you
Yeah,
go. Got to get the throat in there.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's yeah. I'm from Denmark, and people always say, "Oh, you must be like the Dutch." No, 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 no. Dutch is like Danish if you have a really bad cold.
Yeah. It's more aggressive.
there's a how do you guys like? There's like a little flu bug going around. Everyone's like coughing and having. How do you guys cope with a sore throat and having to do all those sounds?
I have no idea.
I've always wondered.
It's
Okay,
not something I'm very very aware of. It's just the way we talk, I guess.
that got off to a weird start. I'm sorry about that. So, Jonathan, you were the composer for the Seventh Guest VR remake.
Yep.
Um, could you just briefly, for my benefit and for everyone else's, like how'd you get started as a video game composer, and how long have you been doing this?
I've been doing this for quite a while now. I think next year is going to be my 20th year working in video games. So that's thinking about that, it's kind of crazy that I've managed to, you know, keep going for 20 years and finding fun projects like these and just being able to, you know, make a living out of the stuff that I love doing, which is, always a treat. Um,
Damn, I wish.
and that's kind of like a funny story. We as a fan of video games, like yourself, and I still am. Getting in touch with Frank Lepaki, who was my mentor for a couple of years after. I was a huge fan of his music in Command and Conquer. And back in those days, early days of the internet, I basically, you know, um, took a leap of faith and, tried to guess his email address at Westwood Studios and sent him an email. And back in those days, it wasn't as intrusive as it is right now, because people weren't getting that huge amount of emails, I guess. And he was very kind, and he responded very kindly, and we sort of developed this mentorship slash friendship relationship over the years, and he really encouraged me to follow my passion into video game music. And I sort of developed into that. And I got a chance roughly 20 years ago with a starting studio, a young studio, that I learned about from a friend. And actually being in touch with Frank and mentioning him as my inspiration actually got my foot in the door and actually helped me, because the studio owner was a huge fan of his music as well. So we had a shared passion there, and that's sort of how that got the ball rolling for me. And I worked in that studio, and it went down during the financial crisis. I joined another local studio where I worked on fairy tale fights and iPad for Sony. iPad, as in a small pad that you could actually control with the Move controllers, and it had a lot of augmented reality elements to it, which was really cool. And then when that studio had to close down, also due to the follow up on the crisis that was happening back then, I decided maybe it's time for me to start freelancing and doing my own thing, which obviously is a lot of work and took me a lot of effort to get that show on the road. But yeah, here we are after so many years, so many projects, and still doing a lot of fun stuff. I think I'm pretty lucky. Being able to do what I do, and especially working on projects like the Seven Guests, which is obviously quite a highlight in my career.
Oh wow! Well, so many things. I gotta put this shit in order. So okay. So first of all, Frank Klapaki. Now, when I saw the credits list on the soundtrack to the Seventh Guest VR, I was like, "Holy shit, Frank Klapaki on drums!" because yes, Command and Conquer, obviously, but he was like the Westwood musician guy. So when I played games like Kyrandia Hand of Fate and stuff like that, when I had this really groovy MIDI soundtrack, it was beautiful. I was like, okay, Frank Klapaki's my spirit animal. So that's really cool. So that kind of explains. That was one of the questions I had on my list. It's like, how the shit did you get Frank Klepaki in on drums? Well, I did not know that he was a drummer. Anyway, so I guess my main question on that one is, what is your main instrument? If he's on drums, what's your like?
I'm like, as you can already tell from the back of my studio, I'm a huge synth geek, so I'm really into electronic music and doing that kind of stuff. I'm not very humbly put. I'm not much of a performer myself. I do play keys, but I do love sitting down, doing experimentation, doing weird stuff, recording stuff, and basically fleshing out ideas that I had. And that's something that also grew with making that transition from I do like listening to music. I like different types of music, but I also like the whole narrative aspect that comes with scores for film and for video games. And looking back, my fascination has always been with soundtracks and scores. Right, the first album that I bought was actually the soundtrack to Jurassic Park by John Williams, which is an odd choice for I think it was like 8 9 year old something ish. So I somehow that's always been there.
That's a great soundtrack.
Yeah,
That's,
I mean it's amazing, and it's one of the best composers of our current age, which is also a shared passion that I have with Frank. So that's also a fun one.
hmm.
But that it's always been there, and somehow things clicked into place when I found out I can actually pursue this path and make a living out of telling stories in video games, which is sort of like my favorite medium, combined with the thing that I love listening to and being experiencing.
Hmm.
So yeah, that's where that came from. And obviously synthesizers, they played a major role in my upbringing. I know my dad has always been very much into technology, early PCs, programming stuff, as well as electronic music. Jean-Michel Jarre kind of music. So I
Ah,
grew up on all of these influences and being very influenced by electronic music, and that somehow always is something that stuck with me.
oh wow. So I'm gonna go out on a limb here and guess that you are a child of the '80s.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I had a Discman and I was listening to Jean-Michel Jarre's Rendezvous in high school, and people were like, "What the fuck are you listening to?" It's like, yeah,
Yeah.
but this stuff rules. Yeah, does it really? Yes, it does. I mean, the fucking laser harp sound on Rendezvous is just one of my all-time favorite sounds. Just generally, I even
He's
had Fred, our keyboard guy, go to, okay, can you do that on one of the tracks because I really want that in there. Um, Shit. So okay. So electronic music, more of a composer. And what made you pick the interactive medium rather than scoring, say, film or TV? I'm gonna guess the non-linearity of games and being able to explore themes in a more non-linear way. But putting words
Yeah,
into your mouth right now.
I think it's even more simple than that. It's just basically, I grew up on early video games, and that was sort of my medium. Like being very into playing all sorts of games, going through all of those different cycles that we had, um, uh, being inspired by video game soundtracks, which was also a big thing. Like if we take Frank's music, for example, was the first time for me that I came in touch with certain musical genres and styles that I had never been in touch with. I would not be listening to metal or industrial kind of music, and that sort of opened up my entire music experience and being more versatile. And that's something that I love in video game music, that there tend to be less rules. It tends to be more fluid in style and experimentation. And there's amazing music out there. Not to say that film doesn't have amazing music. Like obviously film scores. There's so much there's out there that's so amazing and really inspirational. But you know, games were my medium. That's sort of like it feels like. almost like a personal journey, having been there through the whole development cycle, early DOS games and then going to Windows and seeing the whole, rise of Nintendo and Sega and all that those impactful moments in video game history. And that sort of stuck with me. It felt like a personal development as well.
Again, kind of guess. Did you also make mixtapes of, I don't know, old Commodore 64,
Oh
Nintendo
yeah.
soundtracks? Yeah.
Yeah,
Again,
yeah,
my
I would actually.
classmates gave me some weird looks when I was a kid.
Yeah. I would do that actually. I didn't start actually listening music in classes until the Discman age and bringing CDs.
Hmm.
But I think at least 50% of the music that I would put on those CDs were usually video game music. And I would actually record out of my tape deck and then route it to my PC and then start recording video game soundtracks like Warcraft stuff and Command and Conquer and anything that I could get my hands off where you could actually play the music without having sound effects or voice effects on top of them.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
that was a big thing. And that was no, I don't want to get sidetracked. I want to stay on this. So you said that Frank introduced you to different genres, things that you hadn't explored before, like the harder stuff, metal and industrial, which I assume is Command and Conquer because Hell
yeah,
March. I mean, everyone knows
yeah.
Hell March. So what was your main like musical genre before your horizon sort of broadened? Where did you start out? You said electronic music.
Yeah. I think it's a mixture of electronic and again cinematic narrative music. And that's you're always like the product of your upbringing and whatever your parents bring into the household. And that's just basically out of my recollection of the stuff that I can recall, that I obviously would very much eye and listen to the stuff that my dad would be listening to. And that was, obviously growing up in the 80s and a lot of that kind of stuff being very much, high on the agenda. I mean, very focused. Like all the pop music during that age had, synthesizers and electronic elements into it. So I guess it's just like a natural thing that, almost like a nostalgia combined with, that's just um, it's just my school. It's just growing up on those elements and film scores, obviously as well. Watching different kind of movies as a kid, having these very very awesome soundtracks that just stick with you. Iconic movies, and I guess that's just basically a blend of everything and
Yeah.
then thrown in.
Did you ever have those compilation CDs, synthesizer greatest?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
that's the big, massive box sets of different covers of
yeah,
synthesizer stuff. I used to bring those to school as well.
yeah,
Yeah, oh god, it was so good. Is there? This is just for my personal benefit because I just have to know. The one you're absolutely right about the going through your parents' record collection kind of thing. So my dad was a bit all over the place. He was a massive Beatles fan, but he also had some slightly mellower stuff, and he was also into like Deep Purple and Black Sabbath. So it was like a big range of stuff there. But the one album that got me into wanting to do music for myself was Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells. So is that anything you've run into? Because that album runs like the entire gamut from like super mellow and folky to almost like metal aggressive.
yeah. I mean, yeah, those kind of albums, obviously, it's the kind of stuff that somehow uh, did something for the first time, and it kind of stuck with me as well. I don't think my dad was a very avid Beatles fan, but I do, those songs that are a part of their track list that are very iconic because they use different kind of instrumentation, or there's a mellotron in there, or there's
Mm.
a very interesting hook in one of those tracks. I think those tracks they are also part of my upbringing. So there's cherry picking and that kind of stuff, but it's very relatable. All of those albums that did something new, and that tried something new, and there were a lot of pioneers during that time. So I think a lot of that stuff is sort of engraved in my brain, and
Oh,
yeah,
absolutely. I mean, the first time I heard the Doctor Who theme from like the mid
yeah,
'60s, late '60s, I was like, "What the hell is this? This is
yeah,
awesome." Um, So, getting into like the seventh guest, if I may ask, how old were you when the seventh guest came out in
Oh, that's
'93?
a good one. It's 93, so I was like nine, nine-ish.
Ooh. So, did you
Um,
play it when it came out, or
yeah,
was
I recall we had I think we had a shareware version or a demo version where you could only do one room or maybe just walk around through the corridors and just, soak up the atmosphere. And obviously it was like super scary that, just that experience alone. And back then, FMVs were getting, more in your face and more realistic, which was also a huge leap coming from, you know, uh, uh, just seeing pixels on screen
yeah,
getting moved
absolutely,
around, right?
yeah.
Early DOS kind of stuff. Um, but that's my recollection, is that it had this very weird, almost weird like, but also very, because it was so weird, it sort of contributed to the fact that it was super scary for me as a kid, because it made no sense in my head. It was like unpredictable. It felt unpredictable. It had music that I would not necessarily instantly think of in such a setting, and that would sort of, contribute to feeling uneasy and feeling very, played with.
Hmm.
So that's my real honest recollection of that. And then obviously I went back, for when I heard we were going to do this, I went back to the game and sort of uh, got to fill in the blanks. And for me as well, it's always an odd thing when you go back to something so many years later and see if the thing that's stuck in your brain is somehow the actual thing or just my interpretation of it. um, and I think working on this game, I sort of used those two elements, like what the game actually was, but also what it did for me personally, how it felt to me, and sort of get going from there, because I felt it was a more honest way of going in and writing for this game.
Yeah, so a little off-putting. You're absolutely right, by the way. The soundtrack to those games is like, why is there circus music? Why are there African drums?
Yeah,
And this is why I love ghost stories more than any other type of horror genre. Is exactly because what you said. It's unpredictable. You have no idea what's going to happen. There are with vampires and zombies and such. You got your rules. You know exactly what's going to
yeah,
happen. But ghosts, anything goes.
yeah,
So your approach to sort of, I'm not going to say remake the soundtrack, because the soundtrack is definitely your own. You got little hints and nudges to the original soundtrack in there, but for the most part, you basically wrote your own score and referenced, the old one, kind of like the new Blade Runner movie has a completely original
yeah,
score and references little bits and pieces of the old one.
yeah.
Was How much did you want to lean on the established soundtrack and the established motifs, and how much did you want to do freely on your own account?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's also a very nice comparison, because it sort of felt like, not necessarily like Blade Runner, but more like, the different kind of approach, going back to something that is so dear to so many people, and then sort of getting tasked in, let's do this again but different.
Yeah,
Which is,
just do the same but a
yeah,
different way.
let's build a Ferrari, but it should be a Ferrari, but it should not be a Ferrari. That's
Yeah.
sort of like how it felt. Um, and it took me some time to think about how I wanted to approach this. I think my first comment was to Paul, the game director, you know, um, whatever we're gonna do, we either do a one-on-one direct um, uh, translation of the original score, like we do a verbatim a process there, and it's going to be, the exact same tracks, just different instrumentation. But as I thought longer about it, then the second option to me was far more appealing, which was, lean on how it felt to listen to that kind of music back then in the day, and how the game felt to me, and do something that is different, its own thing, majorly because there's nothing I can contribute to the original that is going to make it any better. There's nothing in there that I can do to have players experience it, in a way, and say, this is this is actually adding something to something that has already been there, right?
Mm.
To me, it feels like how they do a lot of those reboots and remakes of movies, and they never ever get any better. It's always, it's, oh yeah, it's a remake, it's modernized, it feels more like of this age, but it's not necessarily a better thing. And I wanted to stay away from that, because I have a lot of respect for George and his work, and I feel that, in general there isn't enough respect and gratitude towards the composers that went before me, all the people that sort of you know went into uncharted territory and tried something new. And I wanted to do something that is sort of like an homage to this composer and this game in that sense, and give my own spin to it. So that's eventually the approach that we went with, and I think we went that approach for the entire game. So it sort of was a good fit.
No, that's good. I'm glad you went with the do your own thing approach and not the remake the soundtrack, because that's our thing. And no, just kidding. But also, I don't know if this is going to get me canceled or something, but you're absolutely right in the sense that when you do a remake, I'm thinking of the Rise of the Triad remake that came out with Lee Jackson's music, where Andrew Hulshult, brilliant dude, absolutely love his work. He redid the Doom soundtrack, and it's done a multitude of soundtracks for FPS games and such. But basically redid the Rise of the Triad soundtrack in metal style, and didn't really do much of anything other than add some double kicks and some distortion guitars. And it's like, nah, come on, you could have done something different. So I'm
Yeah.
really glad that you went with the more original approach.
I mean, it's a hard thing to do, right? And I sort of approached it again as you know. I have my own experiences with this game and the music, but in general, just looking at anything that I would be a big fan of, and then sort of thinking how I would experience somebody else taking that, with the best intentions and putting all the effort in, and then sort of remaking that, it would, as a fan of something, it would never connect with me as much, right?
Hmm.
So I wanted to sort of first disconnect and then reconnect again, in a different way, via a different route. I think that was my main approach.
Yeah, and listening to the soundtrack for Seventh Guest VR, it's very jazzy, especially in the drum department. I would say there's a lot of stand-up bass, there's a lot of vibraphones, there's a lot of twinkly chromatic percussion and stuff like that. You went for a very low-key, spooky, almost kind of cuddly, but and then every once in a while some discordant strings and stuff comes in, so it's sort of low key. Whereas the original soundtrack would go, 1 minute it would be a jazz number, and the next moment it would just be African tribal music for some reason. So what made you go with that style? Was it the game design, the graphics, how they were putting it together? Was it a directive, or was it just your own personal? This is what this game needs.
Yeah, I think it's a natural evolvement in what I feel, where we are right now with video game scores, where indeed it's getting less of a standalone thing and more entwined in what the actual game is. Um, which again, I don't want to downplay anything that is in the past, but there's sort of like there's been this growth maybe where we decided, okay, video game music needs to be responsive, but it needs to fit with gameplay. It needs to, there's a lot of more, demands when it comes to that kind of production. Um, and I also felt that the tone of this game, because it's VR and it's so intimate and in your face, I wanted to do something that felt intimate. And to me, that felt like going more for a slight minimalistic approach in instrumentation, picking instruments that sound like a very small ensemble based kind of thing. So I stayed away from anything that made the original sound bigger. So I stayed away from choir. I stayed away from having very extensive string ensembles and keeping everything very very close and to the player, because that's how it felt to me, when I looked at the concept art and the ideas that they were going for. I feel it's more of an slightly more of a personal experience, more in there, whereas the original was more of an exhibition kind of feel to it. I'm not sure if that's entirely covering what I'm trying to say, but to me it felt like it was more a personal journey and being more actual tactile with everything in the house,
Hmm.
and it presented itself with a perfect opportunity to do something different in the music as well.
I think you made an absolutely brilliant call there because, as you say, it's an intimate. First of all, you're wearing the helmet, you're actually there, and you can pick up and examine everything. And the mansion itself feels smaller in a way. It's not this, the grand staircase, all this empty space in the original. It feels a little more cramped, and so going for that intimate style was a really brilliant touch. Um, Shit, I had a question there. Please join in anytime. Um, I'm just gonna look over my thing. Okay, so you were talking about. I'm a professional. So you were talking about keeping it intimate, keeping it kind of quiet, whereas what we've been doing to the soundtrack is sort of in the opposite ball game. So first of all, I'm just going to ask you because I saw you ask this on Twitter at one point. So can anyone recommend me some good metal on a Friday? So are you into metal, industrial music, and stuff like that?
Yeah. I mean, I'm a big Nine Inch Nails listener. I do
Yes.
like. I'm not like. I don't consider myself a very hardcore metal person, but I do really appreciate, bands that are. People are probably gonna kill me for this, but bands that feel to me are more musical in tone, if that makes sense. So there's a lot of material that goes into the noise kind of range, which is not entirely my thing. So, when the singing becomes too much of screams and shouts in that direction, I sort of zone out. So I do really like instrumental stuff as well. Obviously, Metallica is a great band, so I love listening to their stuff. But even more heavy stuff like Rob Zombie kind of stuff, which to me feels very musical in its approach, even though it can get pretty brutal in certain tracks. But that's it's I guess there needs to be a certain hook for me to hook onto, and that's not just for metal. The same goes for industrial kind of stuff. If it sort of tickles my creative sense, brain, um, uh, I enjoy listening to it. So it's pretty versatile in that sense.
I think I agree completely, and I think you put the nail on the head there because I remember putting on a Slayer record when I was a kid, and I was kind of like, okay, so everyone's into Slayer, I should probably listen to this record, and I sat down at the computer, records playing, and I look over and I go, wow, like 10 or 15 minutes have passed. This is a really long opening track, and it turns out I was on track 7. So the whole thing just sort of blended
Yeah.
together in a way. So that doesn't really like hit me. I'm so glad you said Nine Inch Nails because that's actually my favorite band. And I love the blend of because I started out as a synth guy as yourself, and then I got into I had a little pop punk phase in the '90s in high school, so I discovered how distorted guitars are pretty cool, and then I discovered Fear Factory, which is like a combination of synthy stuff and metal stuff, and I was like, "Yep, this is my jam."
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
So you've listened to the abomination that we've created out of the seventh guest.
Don't be so hard on yourselves. Yeah. No, yeah, I try to, because time in recent weeks has been very limited.
I know, and we're
And
coming
I
up on Christmas as we're recording
actually
this.
just shipped another title, Arizona Sunshine 2, which is, was also quite a big title to work on. And it was actually my third score that I'm pushing out this year. So it
Wow,
was a bit crazy. And all
keeping
three of
busy.
them are different musical styles.
Oh wow,
So yeah, but I did check some of your tracks for sure, and I really listening to them. I'm really interested in, again, maybe the same question that you had for me is sort of which elements did you pick on, keeping from the originals, and how do you go about deciding, because the tracks are very different from the existing material in a lot of parts. So I'm just curious on how your creative process in that sense is.
It's I'm very glad you asked that question because it's actually kind of a cheap answer. We took the original MIDI files from the game and just shoved them in our audio workstation, and just started picking different instruments for the
Mhm.
different different tracks and doubling them, changing the arrangement around, eventually adding guitars and drums and everything else, and it just sort of grew out of. So basically, we're taking the original stuff as it was in the game, and just sort of wrangling it, bringing it apart. So everything we've even got a lot of the original percussion tracks, and a lot of the original keyboard lines are taken straight from the game, essentially, which we can do luckily because George has the rights to the music, so we can actually use the original stuff.
Yeah, I mean that's cool.
Um, yeah, so that's the creative process. It's basically just take, well, how does the original sound? I was like, okay, this is a tango. What would it sound like if we put dubstep drums on it?
Yeah, that's. I mean, that's an interesting approach. It's like you say, it's an entirely the other direction that I went for my score. So I think um, it's very original in that sense that it does something that hasn't been done before. It's not a direct remake. It's not a very um, um, how do I put this? It's not a very usual approach to redoing this soundtrack, which I think we talked about that earlier. Like if you're going to do something like this, put your own stamp on it in a way that makes it interesting for both fans and non-fans to listen to.
Mm.
Um, and I think that's definitely you're definitely doing that with this release for sure.
Oh, thank you very much. And I enjoyed your music a lot too. I've been listening to the whole soundtrack, posted on Bandcamp, by the way. If anyone's just go and have a look at that. And it also has a very nice flow through it. A lot of the tracks are like really short, but it all just sort of, unlike the Slayer album I was talking about, where you just look over and go, "Wow, that's a long track." This one has an ebb and a flow, which is what all great concept albums should have essentially. And when it all is tied together, it tells the story of the whole game, which is also kind of what we tried to do with ours in a sort of sense. I had to pick a couple of tracks to ask you about. So obviously downstairs, the walking around music, which is a nice jazzy rendition you've got, and a very eerie little instrumentation going on. This is one of the tracks that lifts quite a lot from the original. Was there a keen? Were there like a group of tracks where you go, okay, I need to get that melody in there?
Yeah. When I started, actually, how we went, the original approach was we first did a proof of concept internally, as well as for the people at Trilobite, so we could actually showcase, this is what we're trying to do. Are you going to be happy with this approach? Is this something that you feel is a nice continuation of what you guys did? And we started out with the library actually. So that was the first track that I did, and I delivered the track, the first sketches to Paul, the director, and he's like a very hardcore fan of the original game as well. Like this whole project. Without him, this whole project would never have happened. Like he's been I've known him for quite some time now, and we the last company that I worked in, he was also working there, and we worked on Fairy Tale Fights together. And I recall we had a lot of these talks during that time. I think it was 2010 ish, I think, about how he was hoping that one day somebody or he would be doing something with the Seven Guests, right? Because he was such a huge fan. He was a huge fan of George's work as well.
Mm.
So he was like the perfect specimen for my sketches, right? So me sending him my first ideas, and when I first talked to him, he was like, "Yeah, but it's just words, right? So it's very hard to express how it sounded in my head. In my head, it was already there, but it was very hard for me to convey it to him without actual music.
Mm.
So I did that first demo. He was like very ecstatic about it, and he said, this is this is just, it feels right. Like it's instantly I'm there again. But it feels like something original and new, and it's very exciting for me to listen to. So that's, that was my first thing to tick off the box. Like if a hardcore fan like Paul would actually enjoy this, then I'm on the right track, right? So I took that at heart. And then we got to go to do the full game. And I felt that the downstairs track needed, like the foyer track that we had. It's the first real music that you hear in the game, and it was actually a deliberate decision as to not have any music in the whole outside part of the house, because I
Mm.
felt that in the original, the game actually started inside the house, right? You get the whole story prologue thing. We get the boot up with the logo, and we get the thunderstrike at the house and the logo of the game, which we sort of try to redo outside. I sort of took that initial stinger and put my own stem on it, and we actually had the theme sung. So that's one of the most one-on-one interpretations that I did, was probably that first moment of that house waking up.
Mm.
Um, and I felt that whenever I'm in the house, I need to instantly feel at home, and needs to feel like this is the seventh guest. There's no doubt about it. So that's why I made sure that there is enough material in there that is recognizable. Um, and I wanted to do something that was interesting as well. That where obviously we had the downstairs, we had upstairs as well, so you could go upstairs to the corridors. And I wanted to have something there that felt like more or less seamless. So I had this version, and I had another version, and we could sort of on the fly transition from one to the other, to the upstairs version, which is more upbeat, which has drums, which is less melodic, and has a bit more of that jazzy, kind of movement to it. Um, so that's basically the approach that I took. So I wanted to have a track where I could go in two different directions. So it needed to be versatile in that sense. And I wanted to have a track that has recognizable elements to it. And it had to be spooky, because the first impression that you have, you walk in, is slightly different from the original. Like in the original, you get into the mansion and it doesn't necessarily instantly feel spooky, right? But we have like a hallway that is covered in cobwebs, and it's dusty, and it's broken down. There are scary paintings. I wanted to sort of nail that instantly.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you say that you wanted two different versions of the same piece of music, essentially, for the downstairs and the upstairs part. Uh, in the 11th hour, when you go from the downstairs part to the upstairs part, the upstairs hallway is like really frantic, and the BPM just switches way up, and it's one of the more chaotic music parts in the whole game. So you're just like, oh shit, what's coming? Um, so I'm kind of glad that you went for the more sort of seamless transition thing. Um, and I love the idea that you have the familiarity. Like, okay, you're back in the mansion if you were a fan of the original, or you're just like, right now, this okay. Fans of the original will see this, they'll listen to this and go, okay, we're back. This is going to be awful. This is going to
Yeah,
be great.
yeah, yeah.
uh, there's another track called "We Had Dolls Too," which takes all the which I thought was interesting because it took all the memorable instrumentation of the original Dolls of Doom, which is that twinkling glockenspiel, doo, 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 doo. But it doesn't really copy that melody. It just sort of harkens to this is what the original sounded a bit like, but it's like a complete reinterpretation, like you wrote your own piece that sort of follows that same motif. How did that come about?
Yeah, I had for this one, I felt that it was so iconic, and there were one or two tracks. I believe I think it's Save and Align. I sort of had to rename the tracks, obviously, when I did the soundtrack. So sometimes I have to think about, okay, my working titles. How did I
Yeah.
transition
Oh,
those into actual track names? But I think it's a Save and Align, which borrows from the puzzle theme that was in the original.
yeah. The music box
Um,
theme.
yeah, And those were, to me, those felt like the two motives next to, obviously the main theme, the game theme that is in the game as well. Um,
It's a very confusing naming scheme
yeah,
he's got going. By the way, the
namely,
game
yeah.
is the game theme.
The track, the game, which
Yeah.
had the main melodic content of the seven guests. Um, I felt those three were, to me, the most recognizable parts. So if I were going to, use anything that needed to be instant seven guest, for me, it felt just like a natural choice. So I felt that, obviously, given the whole storyline being, focused on the dolls, I felt that, there had to be a reference to the Dolls of Doom track to it. Um, and then I tried different kind of things and tried to play with it. And it's very, the original has a lot of tempo variation into it. It ramps up and it slows down, and it has, to me, it feels very cinematic in its narrative, right? It's a very fixed narrative. And that was less applicable for us in this game, because this was going to be more of a background track, solving puzzles, being focused on this actual room, which is the doll tea room,
Mm.
which is also, a pretty weird and scary room where you can actually hack off heads of dolls and then put them back together again. And meanwhile, there's kids' voices talking to you as you cut off their heads, which is, kind of dark.
I mean, I love
Um,
the original scene in the doll room, and I thought, okay, that's pretty creepy. And then I saw, I mean, I don't have a VR, so I haven't actually played the VR game, but I've seen playthroughs of it. And once they get to the doll room, I go, okay,
yeah, it's
that just got
pretty
creepier,
dark.
didn't it?
Yeah. So, and then, to me, it also feels that the main progressions that were in the Dolls of Doom, it also fit that setting perfectly. It was dark. It felt playful in a very dark way. Um, and then I sort of, pick those elements, those that first motive that's in there, and sort of played around with it. And I think, yeah, that my version is slowed down, and I have a lot of other points where, if you pick the library room, I did sort of like a similar thing where I lifted a certain chord progression section of a track that to me felt very seven guest in its progression, slowed it down, and then, started doing different kind of harmonies, doing different kind of
Hmm.
elements to it, and sort of molding it into something new where, the bass would still be, the seven guest in a sense.
Yeah, but I mean, what I really like about this approach versus the downstairs one is the downstairs has the recognizable melody.
Yeah.
It's lifted from the original game, so you have that instant familiarity. Whereas we had Dolls 2 has the same instrumentation and the same sort of rhythmic progression, but it's not the same melody.
No.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So
I, I think for the majority of the tracks, this sort of goes for the majority of the tracks. So I wanted to have elements in there, but that's, it felt like seeing a very, very interesting build of Legos, and then sort of, selecting a couple of bricks and then sort of create my own build out
yeah,
of nothing, right? So that's sort of how I went about it. Take all of those smaller bricks that are in there, those small elements that are, to me felt very interesting, and then sort of mold them into something that is new.
yeah. That's very okay. And the last one I had was Julia's Fate, which starts out as complete ambient, discordant, ghostly whooshing kind of noise, and then there's a big buildup, and then you go all Twin Peaks on our asses. Uh, what was going through your mind on that one?
Yeah, so this is actually a funny approach. So this is used for one of the final volumetric videos that we have. You know the game, so I'm not going to spoil anything for somebody who has not played the game, but
Everyone's dead.
it's a pivotal moment in the game. Um, I always felt that this is also a very dark moment to me. It feels very gut wrenching, knowing the character and their motivations, actually, which in itself are pretty sad, right? And then you get this really sad ending, which is, it's heartbreaking. And then, what we did for the volumetric videos was I had a bunch of tracks that I wrote specifically for use in there. So there were, more, even more downsized, more intimate and smaller in instrumentation. But as we went, we felt that was way too static. So what we did, we took all of different kind of elements and the material that we had for the entire game score, and we sort of started comping new compositions out of the material that we had, more fitting the and Paul also worked on this with me. I had a very uh, put his stamp on it,
Mm.
in a sense, and we felt that it needed something that reflected the volumetric videos more, because it felt too flat and too unresponsive by just slapping underneath one of the tracks that we had. um, so it was a very interesting approach where we could sort of almost like we had this whole palette of colors to pick from, and we could sort of assemble and create something new out of it. And I think for some of these tracks that worked out really well, especially because there's such a roller coaster of emotions and events happening, that you instantly get something that is more interesting. It's interesting that you mentioned Twin Peaks, which was to me was also a huge inspiration for getting saxophone in. I was talking to Paul. I had done one or two tracks, and we were talking, and he said, I think you can push it a bit further. I think we can go do something that is less conventional. It can be less, it can be more weird, it can be more. But I also didn't want to have a disconnect from, obviously the whole era that this story is playing out, right? And the mansion that we're in, it should not feel too disconnected to the narrative and the storyline. Um, and I really loved how George did that in the original, where he blended and fused all of these different kind of genres. So I felt, let's maybe we can go slightly Twin Peaks on this, and then do something that has more of that, almost like foggy kind of room kind of feel, and small ensemble,
Mm.
jazz performance kind of feel to it, and that's where the saxophone came in. And then I had a friend of mine, composer, jump in to play the saxophone on these tracks. Nathan Madsen, who did a really brilliant job. I came to him and said, I want you to play the saxophone, but I don't want you to play the saxophone. It needs to be unconventional. So I want it to be very airy. I don't want to have a whole lot of expressiveness, in that sense that it play very quietly, play very
Mm.
intense and very very intimate. And he sent me the first takes, and it was like spot on. He instantly got what I was looking for. And it just blends very well in the soundscape. It works really well.
That's cool. We kind of had the same experience with because we have our violin player because it's the seventh guest. You can't have seventh guest without a violin in there. It has to be a real violin. So luckily, one of our friends is a classically trained violin player, actually a viola player, but they're technically the same instrument. Fight me. Um, so all the orchestra nerds in the just
I'm
click
not
off the
recording.
videos. Yeah, never. No, but anyway, so for one of the tracks, in fact, the last track on the album, "Mr. Death," which is the menu theme from the 11th Hour, this really strange electronic German, almost Kraftwerk, ghostly, weird kind of song. We just told him, okay, we're doing Mr. Death, but in a Nine Inch Nailsy kind of way. We want you to play the violin on it, but we don't want you to play any actual notes. Just do weird ghostly sounds with your violin. And he just, I mean, he's in the United States. I'm in Denmark, but I could just feel him giving me a strange glance, like across the ocean. It's like, you want me to do what? Just, I don't know, rub your hands up and down the frets or something. Just okay, and we'll take it out in post product. Do some weird stuff to it. So I love that approach of taking the way you normally think an instrument sounds and just doing something strange to it.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
that's where the magic happens. And from my experience working with musicians and knowing their instruments really well, a lot of times they actually really enjoy doing this kind of stuff, because it has them rethink the way they do things, and it makes it more, more like a mutual journey, rather than um, this is the line, play my line, and it's my music, and it's my. I really like working with musicians and go and say, this is the track, and this is what I, as much as I can put it into words, this is what I'm looking for. But if you feel like it, get me a recording, a stem where you do your own thing, where you think that's going to be interesting and what you think will work. And a lot of the times, I use elements of both, and there's a lot of interesting material in there that I feel is just a waste of not being used, and it's such an interesting angle. They know their instruments a lot better than I know them, and they can do bring a lot of interesting material to the table as well.
Yeah, it's kind of like if you get really proficient at an instrument, which I'm not. Luckily, I'm a drummer, so it's not really technically an instrument to begin with. But if you get really proficient with an instrument, you kind of sometimes fall into that sort of safety category where okay, I can play this. I can play pretty much anything. So challenging someone to play their instrument in a way that they hadn't thought of before. I remember Brian Eno did this a lot when he was working with David Bowie. Like he'd hand out cue cards and say, "Okay, you're going to play this blindfolded, or you're going to play this like someone just stepped on your toe," or just, like put them in different weird moods to get them to play something the way they wouldn't normally play it. That's a really interesting approach. I'm glad you also did
It
some of
doesn't
that.
it doesn't always work out, but it makes the process so much more fun. It's how I approach working on my scores as well. Is basically, and maybe this is making my own life a bit harder, but I don't want to go for the thing that I'm expecting whenever I boot up this game, right? So I did this, well, like I said, I just shipped Arizona Sunshine 2, where on the original I did a blend of having sort of like Americana kind of sounds combined with John Carpenter kind of horror scores. So there were a lot of analog synthesizers with Americana sounds, which in itself to me felt newish and fresh and did
Hmm.
something different. And then we went to the sequel, and I was like, I can do the same thing again and just write new music, or I could sort of, pick what was the original again, the feel of the original, and sort of translate it to this new game, which is also slightly different, has a different storyline, has a different narrative, and do something new with it, right? So I'm always trying to not lean over backwards and go into my template and just
Mm, yeah,
throw more tunes at the game, and that's mainly because it keeps my work interesting,
yeah.
and it needs to be interesting for me to get inspired and write music that works in context.
And I think the George, the Fat Man, did the exact same thing. We've been talking to him. He's been very, very supportive of our atrocity, and we were talking about like where do you get your inspirations from? How come there's so much like there's circus music, there's jazz music, there's haunting, ghostly music, and there's everything in between, swing music and all that. How did you manage to mangle all of those different elements into one cohesive soundtrack? And he just went, I just play what I feel like,
Yeah.
and if it comes out good, I'll do it. It's just like to have that breadth of understanding of different musical genres where you can. It's not so much teaching yourself how to play something; it's just being able to just like pick and choose from your different little categories and
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
like Play-Doh, just mash them together and see what comes out.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah. I
beautiful.
think that's the right process. It's actually fun. He played on the chapel theme that we have playing in the game. He played guitar and bass guitar. Initially, I came to him and said, I, there, there was no obligation from the company, but I felt I needed to have something from him in the actual score itself. Just as a homage to, going full circle. We can't ship this game without some actual George into it,
Mm,
right? We needed some Fat Man element. And then I thought, what would be fun is I pick elements from the original Chapel theme and the Chapel Pain theme. Um, and, there's nothing more personal than his own voice. So maybe I'll just ask him to, get me um, some elements in vocals, without actual lyrics, but just as you know, as a very intimate choir kind of feel to it. And then I wrote the track and I got it to him and I said, this is my idea and see if you can do it. And then he came back to me and he had also recorded guitar and bass guitar for elements, which was the kind of material that was nowhere to be found in the score. Like it was the only track that would actually have this. But it fit the track perfectly and it fit the score perfectly without him actually having heard the rest of the score yet. So I figured, this is very, very cool stuff. And I ended up using a lot of the material in the actual track. And I think it's for the better. So that's very, very cool that we got to, just briefly work together on that track and sort of, again, bring full circle my homage to his work and the original game.
Yeah, that's so cool because he's sort of done the same for us, really. And it's interesting that it's the chapel theme or the chapel pain theme that comes back because in our re-recording of the game, as in the song, the game, the one with the lyrics and all that, there's this haunting voice message at the start of the original track, which is Matthew Costello, the script writer, talking about how he wants his lyrics for chapel pain, the ones in
Mm-hmm.
Latin pronounced. So for our re-recording, it's George. George is the haunted answering machine, and he did it in a really, really. He did two takes. He did one in his normal voice, and he did in his normal voice. Sorry, and one in a really spooky kind of way. So we just sort of blended those together, and there's George. He's one of the
Cool.
first things you
Yeah.
hear on the album.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, it blended in really well. I had Lara Sensi on the vocals for the main theme
That's
as
so
well.
beautiful,
So
by the way. So
yeah, I
haunting.
mean, she's an amazing singer. It's crazy, and I've been working on a couple of projects with her in the past, and I felt again selecting the vocals for this instance, this was something that wasn't entirely part of the original. So I felt, there's nothing more personal and more intimate than, a vocal sound because it's instantly relatable.
Hmm.
Um, and I felt she has such a beautiful voice. It was a very nice contrast to the dark story that we're trying to tell. And we sort of got to go back to the game and have that in the menu as well. And that's the main part where you can actually hear the whole phrasing of that original theme. But it's entirely different. So where we had a lot of jazzy elements in the rest of the score, I sort of opted in not going in that direction because the original again was very in that direction. So I wanted to do something that felt more ambient and more, ethereal almost, because that made sense in the whole gist of the story. And then we sort of got back to that again at the end of the storyline, where we get the resolve of the main narrative. And it felt very natural. And again, having George's vocals in there as well as sort of like counterpoint just before that moment of lifting up,
Hmm.
more as a darker moment. It felt like a perfect blend. So yeah, I'm really happy with how that all turned out.
Oh, I love it. I love it so much. And the reason why I really love it is because there is that um, really disturbing dark element about the original story, which is, these are children. They're, someone's killing children and taking their souls and feeding it to some bastard house. So having that sort of and I think that's why there's like music boxes and xylophones and all that stuff in the original soundtrack as well, because they're generally considered to be sort of children's C
Yeah,
instruments. Like you get a kid, my kid has a little xylophone and stuff like that. So having that haunting, ethereal, sort of maternal kind of voice going in the background. It's gonna be okay. It's gonna be okay. And then shit happens. Obviously, brilliant stroke of genius, man.
thank
Um,
you.
I have two questions. I know we've been talking for almost an hour, and I promise not to take too much of your time.
Yeah,
But
that's fine, totally fine.
I have two questions. The first one is one of those boring musical questions. So you say you demo your stuff, and obviously this is before real instrumentation is recorded. But you have so many real instrument elements. You have your stand up bass, and you have your sweet drums, and you have all this really intimate jazz ensemble kind of way. So how do you demo these tracks?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. For me, a demo needs to be, as realistic as can be. So I do spend a lot of time on focusing on getting the expression right of the instruments and trying to, create something that is believable. Um, before I go into actual recording certain parts, certain elements, in that sense, it sort of was slightly easier because I picked a track that like the library track mainly had piano and sound design elements to it. So I deliberately took something that, you know, leaned less on performances. Although I did have the cello in there already playing the original line, which were later live recorded. Um, but yeah, basically it needs to be good. It needs to be believable, and that depends on so many things, on the expressiveness, but also, the blend of the non-musical elements in this sense and the sound design. And that was something that I spent a lot of time on. How much of it should be unrecognizable sounds, and how much of it should be, like the stuff you mentioned, backwards choirs, whispers. There is this manly vocal humming, chanting sound that we have in the basement workroom sections.
Yeah, that's
Which
scary as hell, by the way.
I thought worked pretty well and gave this very, where did this come from kind of experience,
Yeah.
and brought it more into the scary realm. And I really played around with that, reverse piano sounds, doing all sorts of weirdness stuff. But it's in the background, so it's not the main leading element. But take away those elements, it's sort of like the track falls apart because it's very much, the glue that holds all the different kind of instruments and sort of sets the tone, and pushes it more into this whole supernatural realm.
Hmm.
So that was my main struggle, and obviously also being recognizable for the hardcore fans. So yeah, that's sometimes it can be tricky depending on the type of score you're doing. Um, and there's also been cases where I said, okay, this is difficult in different projects where it's difficult to actually get this result without recordings. Then we need to do recordings prior a demo being approved. So that's also one of the options.
Hmm. Well, that's it's. You also bring up. So I'm going to add a third question. The interesting approach is how. Um, that's a weird way to start a sentence. Sorry, I'll start again. It's a. You have the unenviable task of having to placate both existing fans of the original soundtrack, of which there are many. It is a very beloved score. People may have opinions about the game itself, but the score is like universally praised. And also not have it be, like you say, a direct one-to-one copy. Put your own stamp on it. So did you ever let those like things creep into your mind where you're going, oh, are the original fans going to hate this, or did you just try to shut that out?
Mm, it was there when I started working on the project. My initial response when I heard about this, I felt a big nope. Because it, it's kind of like it adds a lot of pressure to it, and
You're never going to be able to please everyone.
right. So from the get go, but that goes for every single game score that you do, right? There's going to be haters, there's going to be lovers for anything that you do. But I felt that I felt such a burden on me. That's a nice word of play. Not
Feel such a martine on you.
yeah, to not take away from what the original was, and that was mainly my thing. So that was maybe also towards the fan, but mostly towards what was the original. Um, and that has always been on my mind throughout, right? So everything that I did, every choice that I made, I felt, to me, does this feel like it pays enough respect to what the original is?
Hmm.
Does it go too far in a different dimension? Does it fit in the lore? Does it fit in what the original soundtrack did? Um, does it fit in instrumentation wise? Does this make sense? Is it like a natural evolvement, or am I forcing something into this here because I feel it needs to be in there? So that never left my mind, but it's sort of it has been in the background more as I was writing. Also because there's always time pressure, there's always a lot of work that needs to be done. So at one point you have to let that go. But it was pretty scary, seeing the game go live and then waiting for the first reviews to arrive.
Mm.
I won't lie, I told this to Paul, and then the first reviews came in that would actually mention the music as being very truthful to the original and fitting the game very well. And that sort of relieved me of all the stress
Uh,
and pressure at that moment.
I would agree. I think your score is it, like you say, it's an homage to the original. It's its own thing, and you put your own stamp on it. It references the original without plagiarizing is the wrong word, but like it's not like a one-to-one remake. I think you did a fantastic job. But hey, you're a professional. I'm not. So what does that mean? Which is
Sure.
also
So,
the
yeah.
interesting. I mean, it's cool to be in the opposite ballpark where we're an industrial rock band. We don't have to think of any of this. These are basically covers. Like you take like people have covered like old Duran Duran songs in 90s industrial rock styles. It was a big thing. Marilyn Manson's "Sweet Dreams" are made of this
Yeah.
kind of stuff. It's kind of the same thing that we're doing. So we're sort of free from that expectation in a way, and we've also added stuff onto some of the tracks, which I was kind of nervous about because I went in and wrote original stuff, and I was like, I'm not the fat man. I can't really. And I sent it to him, and he was like, "Dude, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine. Go ahead." So I was like, "Oh, that was a big relief as well." Uh, well, I there was one last question, I'm going to ask this because I know if I don't, I'm going to get some comments about it.
Okay.
This entire time we've been talking, I've been unable to take my eyes off of the didgeridoo in the background. Is that an actual didgeridoo, and what do you use
It
that for?
is. Yeah, it is. I have a lot of different kind of instruments here that are all over the place, from modular synths to analog 80 synths,
Well, you're a
guitars,
proper musician then. It's like
bass
it's
guitars, and
just
guitars.
chaos.
Yeah, there's if I get to work, there's chaos, and like I said, I like to do unconventional stuff. I recorded some drums for Arizona Sunshine 2, which I layered with a bigger percussion that I had on some of the tracks. So I'm always trying to sneak some elements in there that are derived from experimentation and doing something weird. So it's not necessarily on one of my current soundtracks, but I buy stuff because I try to experiment and try to new things, and then it sort of sticks around and never leaves the door, which is
Hmm.
good because if tomorrow somebody jumps in and says, "Well, I want to have a didgeridoo recorded in my tracks," then I can actually do that and I can actually jump on it. So
Yeah, I would imagine it's hard to find a good didgeridoo VST. I don't think they make
yeah,
those. It's
no,
a very unique sound. Um, well, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for
you're
the
welcome.
conversation. This was a blast. I feel, without being presumptuous, I feel we have a lot in common in terms of where we came from, the
For sure.
synthesizer stuff, and all that stuff. But you're obviously a very talented guy who's made a living out of doing what he loves, and I envy that
I
with a
appreciate that.
burning passion.
No, thanks for having me and asking these questions. It's always fun to talk about, shared passion, and especially on projects like these. And, it's been a fun experience, and it's something that I fondly look back upon. I'm really proud of the end result, which, is a cool thing to reflect upon. So it's always fun to talk about.
Yeah, you redid the seventh guest in a sense, but you didn't just redo it. You did your own seventh guest thing. Very few people can say that.
Yeah, it's weird. I still vividly see all of those boxes on the shelves in the stores walking by back then when it was such an iconic game.
Yeah,
And then now you can see this little frame here. Now I have my own frame with 7 guests in it, and then that's my name underneath, which is it's surreal. It's weird,
that's weird.
but it's fun.
One last question. Vinyl edition when?
Uh, I can't really comment. So there are ideas, but There's going to be a digital release across the main digital platforms. So right now it's just Bandcamp, and I'm ironing out some details for the streaming platform. So that's going to follow as well somewhere in the coming weeks. So it's going to be Spotify, Apple, the usual suspects. And there are some ideas in my head for doing a vinyl, but it's not 100% sure yet. So I have to explore options. I have to discuss with Vertigo as well. They are obviously a major partner in this as well.
Obviously,
I'm just a freelancing party for them, so we have to work something out on that front.
of course.
I'd love to do one. I feel that if there's one game that sort of deserves this, it's going to be this one. But yeah, I'll keep you posted if something on that front changes.
Please do. And just to cap this off, could you, if, for the nice people out there, where can they find more of your stuff?
That's mainly on Bandcamp. I think Bandcamp is the most filled because it has some of my older stuff as well. But there's some stuff on Spotify as well. I'm trying to get some of my older material in there as well, doing a bit of a remastering and then getting stuff out. But time is always an issue. But I try to be strict from here on to every single score that I do. Whenever the company allows me to put it out, I try to put it on Spotify. So that's probably the best place to find it. I actually released my first non-game album last month called Use of Color, which is a blend of ambient and experimentation and electronics and a bit Nine Inch Nails, Trent Reznor-ish kind of feel to it, slightly.
Kind of
So if
Ghosts,
you're
Ghost 1 through 4, the instrumental album he did? Kind of like that?
it's mostly yeah, exactly. So
Oh,
it's the more mellow ambient kind of approach to what he does, which I'm a huge fan of, which I
hmm,
think is very cool. And it has a cinematic edge to it as well. So definitely, if you're into ambient music, look it up on Spotify or iTunes and give it some streams. So yeah, I think Spotify is the most accessible source for many people.
cool.
Definitely.
And there's your website, musicbyjonathan.com. And the
Yeah.
Bandcamp is also Music by Jonathan, if I remember
Yeah,
correctly. It is. Yeah, okay.
musicbyjonathan.bandcamp.com. So that's easy to find.
Cool beans. All right. Well, thank you very, very much. And
Thank you as well.
yes, keep me updated on the vinyl, and we'll see if we can get a vinyl of our score your way as
Awesome.
well.
Yeah, good luck with the project and wrapping that up.
Oh yeah, we have a deadline on next Friday. It's gonna be fine at time of recording. It's gonna be fine. Yeah, our bass player just shredded his hand during a hunting accident, and he
Oh
has two
God,
and a half
no.
hours of music to record in 2 weeks. It'll be fine.
You'll be
It's not.
fine.
It's
Yeah.
not gonna happen.